Back in the 1970s, severe dry spells were quietly crippling regions across the prairies and interior watersheds. Rivers shrank to muddy trickles, local inland fisheries collapsed, and government officials executed what seemed at the time like an act of pure public goodwill. They loaded up transport tanks with a resilient African fish species and emptied them by the thousands into major public water storage reservoirs and hydroelectric impoundments. Half a century later, up to 80% of the native fish biomass in those affected waters has completely vanished. Nobody smuggled this species across the border in a hidden cooler. There was no illegal release, no overturned fish haul vessel on the highway, no accidental release from a private pond. It was official government policy, signed off by bureaucrats, fully funded by taxpayers, and publicly celebrated as a triumph of resource management. And the very fish chosen for those stocking programs is sitting on dinner plates in millions of homes from coast to coast tonight. Quite possibly yours. Tilapia. This is the tragic story of how a nation tried to combat food insecurity and regional economic decline, only to unleash an ecological crisis it could never take back. I am Ambrose White. On this channel, we trace environmental catastrophes back to the original government paperwork and policy decisions that authorized them in the first place. And this particular disaster carries an official government signature right on the front page. The decision originated within the federal and provincial water development authorities responsible for managing drought-prone interior basins. By 1971, these agencies faced an engineering crisis they could not build their way out of. They had spent decades pouring millions of tons of concrete across regional river valleys, constructing massive storage reservoirs to secure municipal water supplies, and generate hydropower in areas where precipitation could fail for long stretches. The reservoirs filled up as planned, but almost nothing could thrive in them. Native cold water and riverine species had evolved over thousands of years to depend on dynamic seasonal flooding and clean, moving gravel channels. They struggled severely in the warm, stagnant, oxygen-starved water sitting behind massive concrete dam walls. Seeking an immediate solution, wildlife management officers and government biologists imported Nile tilapia from West Africa and stocked them directly into these impoundments. On paper, the entire operation appeared meticulous and scientifically sound. The fish were introduced into specific, monitored water bodies by trained fisheries staff to provide a cheap, reliable protein source for rural communities suffering from economic downturns. Within just a few seasons, those newly stocked reservoirs were yielding higher fish tonnages than native waterways ever had. Commercial and recreational anglers who had been pulling up empty nets were suddenly filling entire boats day after day. Naturally, the program expanded rapidly. What began as a targeted relief project in regional impoundments was quickly replicated across neighboring provincial watersheds and major river basins. By the late 1990s, tilapia had been deliberately introduced into managed waterways right across the territory. Nobody involved in those early decisions was considering the complex realities of invasion biology or long-term ecosystem collapse. They viewed it simply as stocking a public pond on a massive national scale. The fundamental oversight was the nature of the animal they had actually placed into those natural waterways. Nile tilapia evolved over millions of years in the harsh lakes and volatile river systems of East Africa's Rift Valley, some of the most unforgiving freshwater environments on Earth. They adapted to survive shallow lakes, brutal solar heat, and endless cycles of severe drought, where water bodies evaporated down to stagnant, brackish pools before refilling. Any organism that could not withstand those extreme physical conditions left no descendants. What survived those evolutionary fires is a creature with physiological tolerances that read almost like a typographical error in a textbook. Tilapia remain active and continue feeding in water temperatures as low as 8 degrees Celsius and all the way up to 40 degrees. They keep grazing in water so severely depleted of dissolved oxygen that virtually every native sport fish or commercial freshwater species would already be floating belly up on the surface. Tilapia are non-selective, opportunistic feeders, with an unbelievable ability to thrive on whatever resources are available. They graze continuously on benthic algae, aquatic vegetation, and organic detritus resting on the lake bottom. They readily consume aquatic insect larvae, plankton, and the eggs of native fish species, switching effortlessly between food sources depending on whatever happens to be in front of them at any given moment. But the biological trait that makes tilapia virtually impossible to eradicate once established is not their voracious appetite. It is the extreme protective measures the female takes with her offspring. While most native freshwater species broadcast their eggs across gravel riverbeds or vegetation and swim away, a female tilapia picks up her fertilized eggs and holds them safely inside her mouth until they hatch. Even after hatching, she retains the swimming fry inside her mouth for days, releasing them briefly to feed in shallow water and instantly vacuuming them back into her mouth at the slightest sign of movement or danger. She voluntarily starves herself for the entire duration of this protective period. The overall survival rate of a mouth-brooded clutch of tilapia eggs is exponentially higher than that of eggs left exposed in an open river channel or lake bed, and a single female can repeat this reproductive cycle roughly every 4 weeks during warmer seasons. Place a creature like that into a sun-warmed storage reservoir with no native apex predators adapted to hunting it, and the mathematical explosion of the population gets away from resource managers inside of 2 seasons. That was the moment the commercial aquaculture industry took notice. By the 1980s, tilapia farming had ceased being a simple government drought relief effort and transformed into a booming multi-million-dollar sector. Global food agencies began referring to tilapia as aquatic chicken, a nickname reflecting its extraordinary feed conversion efficiency. Commercial fish farmers measure efficiency using the feed conversion ratio, the total weight of feed required to produce 1 single kilogram of marketable meat. While livestock like cattle require anywhere between 6 and 10 kilograms of feed per kilogram of body weight, tilapia reach market weight on a ratio close to 1.5 to 1, thriving on inexpensive plant-based feeds rather than costly ocean fish meal. Then, in the late 1980s, selective breeding initiatives developed genetically improved farmed strains that grew at double the rate of wild stocks. Those fast-growing lines spread rapidly into commercial aquaculture operations around the world. Today, tilapia is one of the most heavily farmed aquatic species on the planet, with annual global production exceeding 6 million tons. A significant portion of that production takes place in floating net cage farms, anchored directly inside the exact same public water reservoirs and river impoundments that government agencies originally stocked decades ago. Commercial operators favor these public water bodies because the water is deep, access costs are minimal, and the natural flow of the river system carries away concentrated organic waste for free. That last economic advantage is precisely where the environmental catastrophe lies. A floating net cage in an open waterway is not a secure, closed containment facility. It is simply a mesh fence suspended in a public river system. Mooring lines snap during violent weather, heavy winter ice or spring runoff tears open the netting, and high water flood events cause reservoirs to overflow their spillways, sweeping millions of farmed fish directly into downstream river channels that were never supposed to host them. Crucially, these river networks and artificial reservoirs do not exist in isolation. Major hydroelectric impoundments and water control dams, strung along interconnected provincial river basins, form continuous aquatic corridors, with each upstream reservoir draining directly into the next downstream section. As a result, an invasive population that establishes itself in a single upstream reservoir gains direct access to hundreds of kilometers of connected provincial waterways below it. Escapes from open net cage aquaculture facilities occur on a regular basis, with the industry essentially budgeting for stock loss as a routine cost of doing business. The cumulative volume of escaped fish leaking into natural waterways over decades of commercial operations has reached staggering proportions. Once tilapia establish a breeding population in a natural river system, 3 destructive ecological impacts occur simultaneously. The first is intense grazing pressure on the benthic environment. Tilapia constantly vacuum the riverbed and submerged surfaces, stripping away the foundational layers of algae, biofilm, and organic detritus that native bottom-feeding species depend on for survival. Nothing looks dramatic on the surface initially. Native fish simply grow thinner over time, produce fewer eggs, and recruitment rates plummet until native populations quietly fail to replace themselves. The second impact is the physical destruction of spawning habitats. Male tilapia construct circular breeding nests by aggressively digging deep pits into soft clay, sand, and gravel substrates. A single colony can transform a smooth river bottom into hundreds of deep craters, kicking up heavy clouds of suspended sediment that choke the water column, smother rooted aquatic plants, and destroy the clean gravel beds that native salmonids, walleye, and suckers require to spawn successfully. The third impact is direct predation on eggs and juvenile fish, including the young of large native predator species that might otherwise have helped keep invasive numbers in check. Beyond the direct impacts of the fish themselves, a fourth threat stems directly from the farm infrastructure. High-density net cages concentrate tens of thousands of fish in a single localized area. The massive buildup of fish waste and uneaten commercial feed drops straight through the netting into open public waters, overloading the aquatic ecosystem with excessive levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. This artificial nutrient loading fuels massive toxic algal blooms during warm summer months. When those algal blooms die off and decay, the bacterial decomposition process strips dissolved oxygen out of the water column, creating expansive dead zones where native aquatic life literally suffocates. Tilapia, with their absurd tolerance for low oxygen environments, easily survive these events while native fish perish. Combine all four mechanisms, and you end up with the grim statistics seen in heavily invaded waterways, where survey catches reveal tilapia accounting for the overwhelming majority of total fish biomass, while native aquatic communities are reduced to mere remnants of their former abundance. Take a moment to consider that reality the next time you browse the seafood counter at your local Canadian grocery store, or order a fish fillet at a restaurant. There is a strong chance that fillet originated from a net cage operation anchored in an open public reservoir or interconnected river system somewhere in the world. And there is no blame to be assigned to consumers. Market demand simply drove commercial development into those public waters. For much of modern history, invasive species issues like this remain strictly localized to freshwater environments because of a fundamental physiological barrier: osmoregulation. Freshwater fish are saltier than the surrounding water and must constantly pump excess fluids out of their bodies, whereas marine species face the exact opposite biological challenge. If you move either into the other's habitat, their cellular structures fail rapidly. That biological wall is why invasive freshwater species were historically expected to remain contained within inland lake systems. But tilapia have been actively defying that rule. The crucial detail that most public discussions miss is that two distinct species are involved in this global story. The primary species grown in commercial freshwater net cages is the Nile tilapia, which can handle moderately brackish water but struggles in full ocean salinity. However, the fish increasingly turning up in coastal estuaries, salt marshes, and tidal inlets is the Mozambique tilapia, an earlier introduction capable of surviving and reproducing in full-strength seawater and hypersaline conditions. Two distinct species, sold under one generic commercial name, blurring a critical ecological distinction. That distinction between species is precisely why environmental scientists and coastal fisheries managers are growing increasingly alarmed. Estuaries, coastal wetlands, and tidal river mouths serve as vital nurseries for the broader marine ecosystem. Commercially vital species of shellfish, migratory salmonids, and countless marine forage fish depend on these sheltered, brackish environments to lay eggs or rear their young away from open ocean predators. A highly adaptable generalist that consumes eggs and fry, tolerates high salinity, and breeds every single month poses a devastating threat to these delicate nursery habitats, environments that provincial and federal authorities never anticipated needing to defend against an invasive freshwater organism. While While domestic stocking programs were expanding decades ago, this exact same species was being deployed across 4 other continents. Nile tilapia has been introduced into well over 100 countries outside its native African range, making it one of the most widely transplanted freshwater species in human history. In Central America's Lake Nicaragua, intensive tilapia aquaculture has operated for decades, coinciding with a severe, steep drop in the native cichlid populations that local artisanal fishing communities relied upon for generations. In Queensland, Australia, tilapia is classified as a high-risk restricted pest. Possessing one, dead or alive, or using one as fishing bait carries severe legal penalties. When an invasive population takes hold in an Australian river system, biosecurity agencies have resorted to poisoning entire river stretches with rotenone, simply because manual netting cannot keep pace with a species that reproduces every 4 weeks. In the warm drainage canal systems of the southern United States, tilapia have established permanent populations since the 1960s, completely altering the localized hydrology and native fish dynamics. So what actually fixes an invasion of this scale? Total eradication in open, connected river systems is essentially impossible. No natural resource agency has ever successfully cleared an established tilapia population out of a major watershed, and the socio-economic argument against complete removal is complex. This fish provides a crucial, affordable source of high-quality animal protein for millions of people worldwide. Furthermore, it produces that protein with a significantly lower land, freshwater, and carbon footprint than beef, pork, or poultry. The fish did not invade these waters on its own. Every single introduction was authorized by government officials managing a public budget. Moving forward, 2 serious paths offer realistic solutions. The first is genetic containment, ensuring farmed fish are physically incapable of reproducing. Producing all-male populations, or inducing triploidy, leaves the fish with 3 sets of chromosomes, rendering them entirely sterile. If a sterile fish escapes from a farm, it lives out its natural life cycle without ever establishing a wild breeding population. The second path is moving aquaculture operations entirely onto land. Recirculating land-based aquaculture systems raise fish in closed indoor tanks, filtering and recycling over 90% of their water while treating waste on site. Nothing can escape into a local river from a secure building on land. However, land-based technology requires higher capital investment than floating a net cage in a public reservoir built with public funds. That cost difference remains the core obstacle. Net cage operations stay cheap because the environmental burden of their waste and escapes falls on the public river system rather than the company's financial ledger. This brings us to the central question worth debating. Government authorities made what seemed like a defensible policy decision decades ago to address water shortages and regional economic hardship. But the ecological bill arrived 50 years later in a currency no budget had accounted for. Do we enforce strict biosecurity regulations on open water aquaculture and accept higher prices for protein at the grocery store? Or do we accept degraded rivers and native species loss as the acceptable cost of a cheap fish fillet? The answer is far from simple, and it carries very different weight depending on whether you are managing a watershed or shopping on a budget. I am Ambrose White. If you want to explore more environmental stories where the disaster leaves a paper trail, subscribe to the channel.